Hi there. My name is Dr. Lee Airton, and I'm a lecturer at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education here at the University of Toronto. I'm delighted to have been invited to participate in this video series, following up on the teach-in about transgender issues at U of T that happened a few weeks ago. And I'm grateful to the Bonham Centre for inviting me to contribute. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways that I teach about transgender issues and lives. And I'm going to start by offering a little bit of context for where my teaching takes place. So like I said before, I teach in the Faculty of Education at U of T, which is Boise. And so all of the people who I teach are wanting to become teachers. So as a teacher educator, I'm very mindful that my students are interested in theory. They're interested in theories of identity and gender and how these things intersect with each other in everyday life. But they're also interested in knowing what they can do in their own classrooms and schools, both in practicum and when they graduate, to better support gender and sexual minority students and colleagues and families. So they're interested in ideas, and I also greatly respect their desire to learn things that they can do. Because we spend quite a lot of time sharing with our students how education has not served minority students and families very well. So I'm particularly interested in telling them what they can actually do now that they have this information, if they didn't already, which increasingly many teacher candidates do as our applicant pool diversifies, which is fabulous. So that's where my teaching takes place. So what I do when I'm not teaching also informs how I teach about transgender issues and practices. So my research, shockingly, is in the area of gender and sexual diversity issues in education. And I'm particularly interested in how we construct the subject of gender and sexual diversity in schools. So who is or what is gender and sexual diversity? What is the model that different policies and practices presume when they think about doing something about these axes of diversity? So that's what my research looks at. I'm also quite interested in gender-neutral pronoun usage and user support. So I've had a blog for about 5 years now called theyismypronoun.com, or TIMP, because I really like how that little word sounds, where I take questions from gender-neutral pronoun users, and particularly, but not only, users of singular they. And I also take questions from parents and teachers and family members and partners and friends of people who use gender-neutral pronouns. And increasingly, I also get a lot of questions about non-binary transgender people. And that's a term that I've come to identify with myself as a person who uses singular they and thinks about myself as outside of male, masculine, or female, feminine in the gender department. So all of these things come together in how I teach. So when I think about what my students at OISE need to know in terms of gender diversity in particular, I'm very careful to not suggest that their concern begins when a particular kind of student walks into their classroom or school, right? So I take the lead of transgender studies scholars like Hilary Malatino, who argue that we should not position transgender as exceptional or position transgender people as the ones who suffer from gender norms or who are subject to gender in ways that are different from how everyone is subject to gender. So I lead my students in understanding how gender norms structure every single classroom. So who's in, who's out, who's cool, how students' preferences for particular objects or even particular brands aren't just kids being fickle or choosy or vain, but they're actually attempts to make themselves safe, when safety can even mean just becoming invisible because they have these objects and they have these things that they're wearing or playing with or saying. So I ask my students, particularly elementary teachers, to think about how all children, including those who are perpetually gender nonconforming, whether they identify as trans or not, or as something else, I ask them to consider how all children in their classroom are trying to navigate this system of power and prestige in relation to what is locally and specifically gender normative in their context. So That's a little different than saying, here are the things that transgender children and youth and adults face, and here is precisely what you can do in any context to mitigate these things. So we do know that many transgender people have experiences in common, but I want my students to be particularly responsive to the place where they teach. What does gender normativity look like? What does cis-normativity look like in the precise place they are teaching? And how are all students trying to live up to these ideas of what their gender performance should be? So that's one aspect of how I teach about transgender issues and lives in teacher education. So yes, I'm also going to talk a little bit about how I deal with the issue of pronouns, which I think is pretty significant given that I myself use singular they, them. Yeah. So it's quite interesting to be a singular they user as a prof because I am in a position of considerable power. So many people who are singular they users are not in the position that I'm in. They are students because increasingly people coming up with this pronoun tend to be younger. So I use singular they, and I introduce my students to singular they as something that they have to learn how to do for me. So for the person who is teaching them and who is marking their assignments. So I'm very mindful of how I can use my power as the teacher to normalize people having different kinds of pronouns. But I always want to remind my students that the things that I do in my own classroom or the best practices that anyone recommends around gender diversity are not always good ideas. So for example, I do a pronoun go-round when I teach smaller classes. One of my favorite things to do is to have students introduce each other. So I do this, so I have them introduce each other, and then I ask them to notice what it's like to be asked about their gender pronoun and what it's like to share someone's pronoun. And then I make very sure that if they forget, I remind them to share their pronoun of their partner. I ask every single person for their pronoun. And then we reflect together on what it was like to be part of that activity, what some of the risks of that activity might be, and also what we might have learned from instances of things like giggling or hesitation when people were asking or sharing pronouns. I also ask them to reflect on my own behavior as the facilitator of the pronoun sharing. So in this way, I use these kinds of sort of best practices like the pronoun go-round as a way to get my students thinking about what gender looks like when we draw excessive attention to it and who might benefit from being gender normative and having a fairly obvious pronoun, whatever that looks like, and versus not. I also use humor a lot when I teach about gender neutral language usage. I try to make it easy and not easy, but I try to make it funny and interesting for my students to think about gender neutral pronouns. So like for example, on the first day of class, sometimes I pretend that my pronoun is a silly word like Zoom, and then they panic, and then I ask them to think about why that would be a problem before I tell them my actual pronoun. So I believe strongly that when we educate around these things, particularly from positions of power as transgender faculty, that we allow our students to know that they can repair if they make a mistake. So every time one of my students makes a mistake with my pronoun, which they do, which is totally normal and to be expected, I always make sure that as a teacher, I allow the possibility that that this is okay now. So they made the mistake, they apologize, they rephrase, either they realized it or I pointed it out, and then we move on together. Because I feel like that's of paramount importance, that people can learn that they can make a mistake and they can move on. So, okay, so those are just some of the things that I do in my own classes at OISE to address issues that face transgender people. I'm delighted to be part of this very positive project of showing the wonderful things that are happening at U of T around teaching in relation to transgender issues and lives, because there are a lot of wonderful things happening. I find this community to be tremendously supportive of me and my work and my students as well. And yeah, and I'm grateful to the Bonham Center for inviting me to contribute this video.